Hi, this is David Wilcock, and I'm interviewing Graham Hancock, who is one of my heroes in metaphysics and spirituality. I originally heard about your work, I guess going back to a bookstore that I went into in 1995 or 96, and I found Fingerprints of the Gods. And what I saw in that book was an astonishing compilation of stuff about Atlantis and pyramids and ancient civilizations that I'd read in hundreds of books. And what you had done is to pick out the very best pieces of information that really give a credible scientific perspective on the idea that there was an antediluvian or pre-flood civilization out there. So the reason why I wanted to do this video is that I am aware that a lot of people, when I told them I was going to see you in London, didn't know who you were. And these are people who should know who you are because they're fans of my work. And your work is so similar to mine in that you have really synthesized a great deal of data. So I believe the first work that you wrote that had a lot of success was called Lords of Poverty.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, thank you for the kind comments on my work, which I appreciate. I've always been on the outside, on the edge of things, not at the center of things. And it's true. Back in the 1980s, when I was still a journalist, I wrote a book called Lords of Poverty, and that was a critical study of foreign aid. At that time, foreign aid was considered to be a sacred thing, like motherhood, and one could not criticize it. But I, during my years as a correspondent, particularly in Africa, but many other parts of the world as well, I saw so many abuses and misuses of aid that I felt that it needed to be documented, and that's what that book was about. But that was a very far in content from my later work on historical mysteries, but similar in the sense that I was standing outside of the mainstream, and looking in, hopefully from an independent point of view.
Now, when you say journalist, I mean that could be a local paper or that could be anything. So, what was your journalism?
My last journalistic job was as East Africa correspondent for the Economist.
So wow, yeah. So
quite a major international news, economics, and business magazine, and
right.
A very serious reportage, and that's where I really cut my teeth on the whole business of gathering, assembling, and presenting information in a manner that can make sense to people.
So you found these human rights abuses going on,
yeah, absolutely,
that nobody was talking about.
Absolutely, human rights abuses and abuses of the whole project that aid is supposed to be for. It seemed to me that the people who the aid money actually comes from, namely us, the taxpayers in the West, and the people who it's supposed to go to, namely the poor in developing countries, were actually being completely disenfranchised by the middlemen, the huge aid agencies and organizations and their staff, who were receiving and spending most of the money basically on themselves, and so I was advocating a situation where you cut out the middleman and we just help one another as human beings. Certainly, it was a situation which had fantastic PR, and everybody thought aid was a good thing. But everywhere I went and everyone I talked to in the developing countries didn't think it was a good thing at all. They thought it was absolutely ruining their lives and investing in huge projects like gigantic dams, which did absolutely no good to anybody. Or massive resettlement and deforestation projects. So I just felt another point of view needed to be given. And that's really what I went on to do with my other work too.
Do you feel that this work that you did in Lords of Poverty helped to create any social change?
I actually wouldn't go so far as to claim that. I think it helped to create awareness. But for the awareness to actually implement in change in the way that things are operated in the world, that would be beyond my powers.
Right.
But I think it did help to create awareness. That book was published in 1989. It's 20 years old now. It's still in print. It's still selling copies. Even though the numbers have changed, the basic analysis of what's wrong with foreign aid remains true. And what's happened is the world has moved on. And the realization is beginning to dawn that no country ever got rich through aid. The United States did not get rich because people gave the United States aid.
Right.
It got rich because of its own independent efforts, helped perhaps by its friends. And that's really, I think, the model that we need to go for in the future.
So how would somebody with a background in The Economist, and you've written this book that is muckraking journalism at its finest, human rights abuses, raising awareness. Everybody knows that when you go into paranormal subjects, that you're basically kissing your credibility goodbye.
Yeah.
So what could possibly have motivated you to do that?
Well, first of all, I never cared about that issue. My view always was, I'm going to tell my truth the way I see it.
Good.
And people can either take that or leave it. And I always applied that to the work that I did before I got into Ancient Mysteries. And I continue to apply it afterwards. I'm going to tell my truth in the best way I can, supported by the best and most solid evidence I can present. And if there's anything of value there, it will stand the test of time. And so that was the first point. The second point was the flow of my own life led me into the inquiry into Ancient Mysteries. As a correspondent based in Nairobi in Kenya during the early 80s, I frequently visited Ethiopia. It was on my beat. It was a place I went to very, very, very regularly. And during visits as a reporter to Ethiopia, I came across the extraordinary, seemingly extraordinary claim that the Ethiopians make to have possession of the lost Ark of the Covenant. The Ark itself, as in Indiana Jones' Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Now, people who don't know, this is mentioned in the Bible. It's supposedly a sarcophagus or something.
Well, a wooden box. It's very clearly specified in the Book of Exodus. It's a box which consists of gold and wood. So there's an outer box of gold, inside it a box of wood, inside that another box of gold. I'll just mention in passing that gold is a superb radiation shield.
Right.
And the whole aura that surrounds this box in the Old Testament is of a dangerous and deadly object.
If you touch it, you can be fried by it. Or
if
something.
you touch it, you die.
Yeah.
There are many accounts of people being struck dead by bolts of fire shooting out from the ark. Now, what the Bible tells us was in the ark was the 2 tablets of stone, upon which the 10 Commandments were written by the finger of God Himself.
Okay.
And so they were seen as the energy source of the ark, which were divine, supernatural, which sent out these bolts of fire and allowed the ark to lift up into the air. There are many accounts in and out of the Bible of the ark being used in battle, of the Israelites carrying it into battle, of it lifting its bearers off the ground, charging towards the enemies of Israel. There's an account where the Philistines briefly steal the Ark of the Covenant from the Israelites. They seem not to know how to handle it. They open its lid, and then within days they're all dying. Tens of thousands of them die. They file past it. They look at it like a tourist object, and tens of thousands of them die. And the Bible states that they died of cancerous tumors.
Consistent with radiation poisoning.
It sounds like radiation poisoning. So all these things intrigued me, and especially so when I went to Ethiopia and went to the sacred city of Aksum in northern Ethiopia during a time when Ethiopia was locked in a deadly civil war.
Okay.
And this town was in a very hotly contested zone. It was extremely difficult to get into. And I found myself in the presence of a monk who was the guardian, claimed to be the guardian of the Ark of the Covenant. He sat out in the grounds of a little chapel annexed to an ancient cathedral, Christian cathedral, called the Cathedral of St. Mary of Zion. And he said, yes, the Ark of the Covenant is in there.
And what's the conventional view is that it either is a myth or that it has gotten lost or something,
well,
right? Nobody knows where it is.
Let me just come to that first. What really tweaked my attention, because remember those accounts in the Bible of how the ark strikes people dead and causes cancerous tumors. Well, these guys, the guardian of the ark, once he's appointed as guardian, he must stay as guardian for the rest of his life.
Oh my
But
gosh.
what I found, and he can never leave the grounds of that little chapel.
Wow.
But what I discovered was, because over a series of visits, I met a series of these individuals because they had very short lives. And over just 2 years, two of them died, and I again went and met the third one.
That's amazing.
And he had developed cataracts over his eyes. And I said, why? What's happening to your eyes? Because I'd noticed that previous ones had that problem as well. He said, the ark is doing it to me. And I said, why? What is the ark doing to you? And he just said, he looked at me very, very level, and he just said, the ark is a thing of fire. And I knew that he was telling the truth, that there was something in there that scared him. and that at the same time he was burdened with the responsibility for guarding and protecting. So I began to feel, actually, there's a really intriguing story to tell here.
Yeah.
And over a number of years, I went into it in some depth, while I was still pursuing economic and business and stories about wars and famines. I was also interested in this. And round about 1989, the same year that Lords of Poverty was published, I decided that I would do a book about Ethiopia's claim to possess the Ark of the Covenant. And that book was published in 1992, and it's called The Sign and the Seal, A Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. And
that was my next question, is why the sign and the seal? What are those things?
Well, the part of your question was also that it's assumed to be a myth, that the question of the loss of the ark is not properly understood. Actually, it turns out that there is a huge mystery surrounding the disappearance of the Ark of the Covenant from ancient Israel.
Okay.
And doubly so because it was the single most important object of Old Testament times. That's why it's the sign and the seal, because it's the sign and the seal of God's presence on earth. That's what it's considered to be, nothing less than that. The Temple of Solomon is built in Jerusalem around 950 before Christ, specifically as an house of rest for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord.
Really?
We know it stays there for hundreds of years afterwards. There are repeated accounts, but then round about 600s before Christ, the references become strange, and it sounds like they're mourning the loss of the Ark. And when the Babylonians invade Israel in 587 BC and steal everything from the temple, they don't find the Ark there. It's already gone by that point. And I mean, I have to cut a long story short here.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that the Ethiopian claim is extremely intriguing, because it turns out that a Jewish temple, exactly modeled on Solomon's temple, was built in Egypt, in Upper Egypt, near the modern city of Aswan, on an island called Elephantina, at exactly the time that we begin to get hints that the Ark has gone missing from Jerusalem. And my suggestion is that the Ark was taken out of Jerusalem because at that time there sat on the throne of Israel a king who was regarded as a heretic, and who had installed a pagan idol called an Asherah in the Holy of Holies of the temple. The loyal priests could never have allowed the Ark to stay in the presence of a pagan idol. I think they took it out, they took it to Egypt, they built a temple for it, they placed it there. 200 years later, and again, I'm cutting a long story very short, they were forced to flee from Egypt again. They couldn't flee north. They fled south. They followed the Nile River system. It brought them into Ethiopia around 400 before Christ. And there's extremely strong evidence that the Ark has been in Ethiopia ever since. And just the final part of the puzzle are the Ethiopian Jews, who are known as the Falashas, or the Beta Israel, the House of Israel. And they practice a pre-Talmudic, purely Old Testament form of Judaism. They don't have rabbis, they have priests. This is banned for the rest of Judaism. They do perform sacrifices supposed not to be done by the rest of Judaism. They have a very ancient Old Testament form of Judaism.
Wow.
And so so I began to feel there's really a huge story to tell here. And that was the sign and the seal, and it led me then into a whole range of other historical mysteries. Just one
When you say Solomon's Temple, what jumps out at me is in Freemasonry, they're always talking about the rebuilding of Solomon's Temple as an analogy for the building of the light body.
Yeah.
So if Solomon's Temple was where the Ark of the Covenant had been stored, then what is the relationship between that and Masonic lore and history?
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, the Freemasons trace their origins back to Hiram Abif, to the original builder, the architect of Solomon's Temple.
Right.
There's an extremely interesting track and line to follow there, and that line, curiously, through the Masons, leads us to the Knights Templar.
Right.
And that was also a feature of my study in the Sign and the Seal, because I found evidence that when the Knights Templar rose to power, and we're talking the late 1100s after Christ, that their primary mission in Jerusalem was not to protect pilgrims on the road between the coast and the city of Jerusalem, but actually to search for the Ark of the Covenant. They took possession of the Temple Mount, where the Temple of Solomon had stood until it was destroyed by the Babylonians. And they carried out excavations there. And then, again, too much detail to go into here, but I believe they encountered an Ethiopian prince exiled in Jerusalem called Lalibela, and returned to Ethiopia with him. And I found Templar crosses all over some of the sacred places of Ethiopia, an extraordinary group of churches at Lalibela, hewn out of solid rock, that I believe the Templars were involved in constructing. So somehow that Masonic Templar theme that goes right back to Solomon's Temple follows the Ark into Ethiopia as well.
Well, this can't just be, I mean, a skeptic could say, well, maybe they have this, maybe the stones are radioactive or something, but if you're describing this object, this golden wooden object, levitating and lightning bolts shooting out of it, wouldn't it be that the radiation might be a side effect of some advanced technology that's inside?
I honestly believe if I were asked to place a bet on this, my bet would be that the Ark of the Covenant is an out of place artifact. It is a piece of technology. It's a piece of high technology. Now, I trace that back through the lineage of ancient Egypt. The objects like the Ark of the Covenant are found in other Egyptian traditions. And Moses, let's not forget that Moses, who's the guy who climbs Mount Sinai and receives the tablets of stone from God, and who is given the blueprint of the ark, which he then passes down to builders to make for him.
I see.
That Moses is reared in the household of the Pharaoh. He is groomed as a future Pharaoh of Egypt. Now, he breaks away from that, but to be groomed as a Pharaoh is no light thing. It means that Moses would have been a master of Egyptian magic. He would have known Hakau, everything that the Egyptians knew about magic. And I believe that incorporated into the ancient Egyptian system, it was, first of all, a powerful belief in magic and the powers of magic. Not superstition, but as a practical thing, a practical skill, a power that can be used in the world. And secondly, that this often manifested in the form of boxes, which were carried on poles and which contained a powerful object which radiated power. There are many, many examples of this that I go into in the book. And so I think the Ark is one of a category of objects that we can trace back in ancient Egypt. Now, the people who could build the pyramids, who could move gigantic blocks of stone weighing hundreds of tons as though they weighed no more than a feather, those ancient Egyptians clearly could do a lot of things that we can't do today. And I think they had, where they got it from, I don't go there. I don't speculate. But I do argue that they were the masters of a sacred technology, a kind of magic, and that this was manifested in the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was taken out of that system and carried off to Israel, but it continued to be a powerful object.
I mean, it seems like if the Knight Templars are spending that much manpower and time and resources searching for this Ark, that they must have felt that if they had possession of it, that they would gain some really important capabilities by possessing it.
Yes, I think they absolutely did feel that.
So what might those capabilities be?
Well, this is the power of God.
Defense system?
This is first and foremost within their system of ideas, and indeed within the system of ideas of the religion of Israel. This is the power of God. This is literally, you know, the sign and the seal of God's presence, as I say,
right.
and the manifestation of His power. So if you can direct and control divine power in some way, then you're the master of the universe. And I think that ultimately the Templars were seeking power, magical, divine power, through the Ark of the Covenant. I don't think they got it. I don't think it was ever brought back to Europe. I still think it's in Ethiopia. I think that the Ethiopian claim is stronger than any other. There are some loose traditions that the Ark is buried under the Temple Mount, that it's buried in a mountain in Jordan, but none of these are associated with a modern, ongoing, continuous tradition of veneration of the Ark of the Covenant. There's only one country in the world where the Ark is still venerated as a living object, and that is Ethiopia. and they've become masters of concealment. There are tunnels and systems underneath Axum where the Ark can be carried away from any threat.
No
the whole
kidding.
city is an armed camp, thousands of men with guns, and not to be taken lightly, because these are the men, the Tigrayans, who overthrew the dictatorship of Mengistu Haile Mariam. They're a powerful force, and the Ark is everything to them, and they protect it with their lives. But there are stories of escape routes, of tunnels, of places that the Ark can be taken out, and one very intriguing story from 1896, when the Italians invade Ethiopia. And the Italians were met by an Ethiopian force carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and the Italians were utterly defeated. It was the greatest ever defeat of a European by an African army in the whole history of the world.
No kidding.
And the Ethiopians also attribute that to the power of the Ark. So I think it's a very serious claim that they have.
So it has like a remote influencing ability, like it made them unable to fight somehow?
No, it strikes people dead.
Oh, really? Okay, so if the people that run it can direct their minds to...
Yes, there's a sacred lineage involved in running it, and you know, so these are the mysteries that I went into and explored. But
now, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, it's a silly movie on some level, but isn't that Nazis looking for this Ark of the Covenant?
That's Nazis looking for the Ark of the Covenant, and there is a story that I've been told by a number of eyewitnesses in Ethiopia that the Nazis, when later on in history, not in the 1890s, but the Italians came back in the 1930s, and they occupied Ethiopia for about 4 or 5 years, just before the Second World War and at the beginning of the Second World War. And there are accounts of Nazis with Italian troops coming to Axum, and of the Ark being taken out through the tunnel system and hidden in a mountain, and then brought back in when they came back. So, and the other thing I'll say about Raiders of the Lost Ark is, actually, it's a pretty good film. And in terms of the extraordinary supernatural power that it shows the Ark possessing,
right,
that is in every sense literally correct to how it's described in the Bible. Exactly like that.
Wow.
So you know, this object and the traditions surrounding it came to intrigue me, and I wrote a major book about it, and it, again, this was the course of my life being switched in a different direction. I'd been a journalist, I'd been interested in economics and politics and all of that stuff, and a series of accidents led me to the Ark. The investigation of the Ark, in turn, brought other synchronicities and occurrences in my path that led me in further directions. For example, because Moses and his Egyptian background and the Egyptian background to the Ark is so important, I had to go to Egypt for the first time, and suddenly I found myself confronted by the pyramids and by the extraordinary mysteries of Egypt, and how Egypt just appears almost overnight, out of nowhere, in the Old Kingdom, just capable of doing almost anything.
Running water, sanitation,
and incredible architecture. Which you know, the architecture like that, it cannot be developed overnight. It requires a long tradition of skill, and that tradition is hidden from history. So, as my friend John Anthony West puts it, it looks like ancient Egyptian civilization was a legacy of something else.
Wow.
And that's when I began to consider the whole possibility of a lost civilization, and that's what led me to Fingerprints of the Gods.
Well, there's a fantastic amount of research in that book. I mean, and I can see you have books all over the house here. So, how did you? What would you say is the thesis of Fingerprints of the Gods?
The thesis of Fingerprints of the Gods is that which was published in 1995, is that there has been at least one major forgotten episode in human history, a lost civilization. Cultures call it by different names. Most commonly it's referred to as Atlantis, but I don't think it was confined to the Atlantic Ocean.
Sure.
I think this was a global civilization, a worldwide civilization, and I narrow it down to the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago. I narrow down the destruction of this civilization to that time, about 12,000 years ago, but I believe it pre-existed that for many thousands of years, and that it was caught up in the dramatic and still not well understood earth changes that took place at the end of the last ice age, and that led to the meltdown of the vast ice sheets that covered northern Europe and North America.
Right, now you prominently feature the Orontius Phineas and the Piri Reis maps,
Correct.
which show the subglacial topography of Antarctica under the ice.
Exactly.
Now, so your belief is that those maps were made when the ice wasn't there. That
Yes.
they're actually original ancient maps.
Exactly. That's why I have a section in Fingerprints of the Gods called "The Mystery of the Maps," because it's one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence to come down to us from history is that certain maps that were copied in the Middle Ages from older maps, we have not got the source maps that those geographers in the 14 and 15 and 1600s.
Okay, that's what
used.
one of the things I was wondering.
We don't have the source maps, but they themselves tell us. For example, Piri Reis, who was a Turkish admiral, on his famous map, of which only a fragment has survived, that shows it was drawn in 1513, and that fragment shows us the eastern seaboard of the United States and the large part of South America, right the way down to Antarctica and the western coast of Africa.
Right.
On that fragment, Piri Reis writes that he based this map, which was a world map, it's just we've lost the rest of it. He based this map on more than 100 source maps that he had found in various libraries and archives in his travels around the world. And none of those source maps have survived. And we are free to speculate that those source maps may have been extremely ancient because what he copied down onto that map unknowingly was an image of the world as it last looked more than 12,000 years ago, when there was still a mass of ice on the land, and when the southern tip of South America actually joined on to Antarctica. That is what the Piri Reis map shows. Same with the Orontius Phineas map. Same with a number of maps by Mercator. They all tell us they were honest. They said, we copied other maps to produce this map, and what they all show, astonishingly, is Antarctica. Antarctica wasn't discovered by our civilization until 1818, but it appears in glorious detail on these ancient maps. And if you follow the progression, you see that the features and character of Antarctica are changing as the maps move on. So it's almost as if they're documenting the meltdown of the last ice age. And some of them indeed do show us what's called the subglacial topography of Antarctica, how the landmass that lies under the ice. And this is really
and that wasn't even known until 1959.
Exactly. It wasn't known until we had very modern technology to run sonar surveys across the ice cap. So I think we have a huge anomaly in these ancient maps.
How the heck does a skeptic attack you on that if they're trying to attack your work?
Amazingly, what they say about Antarctica is that those geographers just felt that since there was, land at the top of the Earth, there should be land at the bottom of it as well. That even though they hadn't got there to check it out, that there should be a sort of balancing continent in the south, and so they just inserted it. And by chance, by coincidence, it turned out looking exactly like Antarctica during the last ice age. This is the astonishing thing that I face, and just will not accept it because it's so paradigm busting. It really does overturn the whole picture of history. And it's not just big dramatic things like Antarctica. There's on a map from 1424, again based on earlier maps, it's what's called a Ptolemaic map. There is a little island shown off the west coast of Ireland, and that little island is labeled High Brazil, Hybrazil, on that map. And such was the belief in the existence of High Brazil. I know of 2 expeditions that were sent out from Bristol, near where we're sitting now, to look for High Brazil. They wanted to go trade with it, find it. So there were all sorts of legends about it. But they would have needed a time machine in order to find High Brazil, because I, working with geologists who are specialists in the meltdown of the Ice Age, was able to establish that an island did stand in exactly that spot, with exactly the dimensions that are indicated on that map, but it was flooded by rising sea level at the end of the Ice Age more than 12,000 years ago. So that map is freezing a little detail from the world of 12,000 years ago. Has to have been somebody there to do that. Mapping the world, and especially with accurate latitudes and longitudes, which are found in these maps, is a pretty high-tech operation. Our culture couldn't do it until the late 18th century. That's when we really began. So you're looking at a evidence of a level of technology that is at least equivalent to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in our society, if not far beyond that. And this is a huge mystery.
Now, these ancient cultures also seem to have mythological statements that had a lot of numbers in them.
Yes.
And the numbers were very curious to you.
I think the numbers are extremely important. There's a body of myths from all around the world that include what turn out to be, expressed in the language of myth and the symbolism of myth. What they capture is extremely precise observations of a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes.
Right.
Which is, everybody's heard about the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And most people are aware that we're living towards the end of the age of Pisces right now. But what that actually means is that if you stand at any point on the Earth on the 21st of March, an hour before dawn, and look due east, you'll see a constellation sitting on the horizon in the place where the sun will shortly rise. And that constellation for the last 2,000 or so years has been Pisces. But because of a wobble on the axis of the Earth, which unfolds very, very slowly, and it's very hard to observe, we're gradually tracking backwards. The sun as a pointer against the zodiac is gradually tracking backwards through the zodiac.
1 degree every 72 years.
1 degree every 72 years. That's the key figure. And it's moving through Pisces and into Aquarius, and the time will come very soon when, as you stand at dawn looking due east on the 21st of March, the spring equinox, you'll see Aquarius on the horizon, not Pisces. Now, to observe this process is not easy, and it requires an accurate interest in astronomy, accurate astronomical observations, accurate solar observations, and for some reason the numbers that relate to precession, as you rightly say, it unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. There are 30 degrees to each house of the zodiac, so that means each age is 2,160 years. And since there are 12 houses of the zodiac, that gets you to 25,920 years for what's called the Great Year, when the entire cycle completes and comes back to the beginning again. It's astonishing that a whole sequence of numbers related to this particular issue, which really, again, is a relatively recent discovery of our civilization, are found in myths that go back to the dawn of time.
And people should be aware that, of course, the cycle changes in 2012. So all this buzz around 2012, it's important to know that there's all these ancient cultures that have all the numbers whose equations resolve to this year 2012.
It's very important to know that, and specifically because the year 2012, which I also go into at length in Fingerprints of the Gods, the year 2012 and its importance is signaled to us by the Mayan calendar.
Right.
Again, if you go in depth into the numerical system within the Mayan calendar, what do you find? You find the number 72 and multiples of the number 72 and divisors of the number 72 all over the Mayan calendar. So it's another precessional object. So it's like a double check. When I find these numbers locked into architecture or myth or really scientific artifacts like the Mayan calendar, then I know that I'm dealing with the same system. And it's very old, and it comes down to us out of the mists of prehistory, and I believe it is a worldwide legacy from a lost civilization.
Now, I believe that as you partnered up with Robert Bauval, one of you guys' discoveries was that the 3 major pyramids of Giza line up with the stars of Orion's belt, and then Leo is the constellation that would be on the horizon during the time that alignment works?
Yes, and again, I have to absolutely pay tribute to Robert Bauval here, because Robert Bauval is the originator of the extraordinarily important Orion correlation theory. He's the genius who saw that connection in the sky between the pattern of the 3 stars of the belt of Orion and the pattern of the pyramids, and who then didn't leave it at simply pattern similarities, but went in depth into ancient mythology, ancient Egyptian mythology, about the god Osiris, whose figure in the sky was seen to be the constellation of Orion, and absolutely proved that the pyramids are constructed on the pattern of Orion's belt. And indeed, we then went further. Robert, that was in his book, The Orion Mystery. And Robert, this is absolutely Robert's work. But we then went on together to write the book that's called Keeper of Genesis in the United Kingdom, and it's called The Message of the Sphinx in the United States, where indeed the plan is shown to be much wider, because the Sphinx comes into the picture as well. And the Sphinx is sitting there gazing due east, the same direction that I told you to look on the spring equinox for the constellation that defines the age. And Orthodox Egyptologists tell us that the Sphinx is clearly what's called an equinoctial marker. It is targeted at the spring equinox sunrise.
Okay.
Orthodox Egyptologists tell us that the Sphinx was built around 2500 BC, which is the astrological age of Taurus. If they were trying to make an astrological connection with that age, they would have built it as a bull, not as a lion. You have to go back to 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago, to find the time when it's the constellation of Leo that houses the sun on the spring equinox. And what we believe is that the Sphinx is a ground figure of the constellation of Leo, and taken in conjunction with the precise positioning of the pyramids in relation to the constellation of Orion, it looks like a star map from around 10,500 BC was brought down from heaven to earth and built on the ground at Giza to freeze, to immemorialize forever in gigantic architecture a date. And that date in our calendar is more than 12,000 years ago.
Right, now for people who aren't familiar with this, I think we should point out that it's not just the three pyramids of Giza that correspond to the Belt of Orion. It's also the Milky Way galaxy corresponding to the Nile River.
Yes.
And there are other pyramids which correspond to the other constellations in Orion.
Indeed.
And so you cannot have this alignment except 11,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's
where everything lines up straight.
A bit more than 12,000 years ago. Really between 12,500 and 13,500 years ago. That's roughly where it sits. Now it's very important, and again, I need to emphasize that the primary work here is the work of Robert Bauval.
Sure.
Not Graham Hancock.
Sure.
I worked extremely closely with Robert, particularly in the involvement of the Sphinx in the whole story. But the incredible work on the stars and on the architecture is Robert Bauval's work alone. And yes, the Nile does come into this configuration in a very interesting way. Now, we're not saying that the ancient Egyptians or the creators of ancient Egyptian civilization actually put the Nile there.
Right.
We're saying that they chose that site because the Nile was there, and it was there in a position that precisely mirrors the position of the Milky Way in the sky, and that Orion's belt lies to the side of the Milky Way, that the pyramids were built in precisely the position that Orion occupies in relation to the Nile, and in relation to the Milky Way, and that the constellation of Leo on the other side is reflected by the Sphinx. So the site was chosen first of all because it had it already had in place certain geographical features that would help to complete this map.
Right.
And I just want to add that actually the Hoover Dam in the United States, built I think in the 1930s.
Okay.
They did a rather similar thing. They created a star map there in the monumental architecture.
Really?
Yeah. Which freezes the positions of the stars in the sky above the Hoover Dam at the time when the dam was completed.
No kidding.
And the reason they did that, when they were asked about it, they said, well, look, suppose in 10,000 years' time our civilization is lost and some future archaeologists find this dam and they want to figure out when it was built. They're not going to be able to read our inscriptions because the language will have been lost. But if they're competent astronomers, they'll be able to work out from the star map when it was actually built. And so that's the suggestion in what's going on at Giza. It's more complicated than that. We're not saying that everything at Giza was built 12,500 years
Certainly.
ago. We're saying that the initial conception dates to that time, and that certain elements of the Giza plan were definitely created at that time. Definitely the Sphinx. Here you have not only the astronomy, but also the geological characteristics of the Sphinx. And again, I need to pay tribute to the work of others, and that's John Anthony West and Professor Robert Schock, who's a geologist at Boston University. They're the ones who've done the work on the weathering patterns on the Sphinx. And it's very clear from the erosion patterns that the Sphinx, after it was built, was subjected to thousands of years of heavy rainfall. And you don't have that rainfall in Egypt in 2500 BC. You have to go back towards the end of the last ice age to get that kind of rainfall.
Right. Well, they call it water weathering. So
That's right.
John Anthony West showed Robert Schock, a geologist, a picture.
Yes.
And he says, "What kind of weathering is this?"
And he immediately
Schock says, "Oh, yeah, it's water weathering."
Water weathering.
But then, well, guess where this is from?
Yeah, exactly.
This is the back end of the Sphinx.
Yeah. The key thing is precipitation-induced weathering that's caused by rainfall.
Rainfall.
Heavy rainfall. And that's exactly what the Sphinx has. And paleoclimatology, well-advanced science, makes it quite clear that there were no such rains in Giza in the time of the pharaohs. So this looks like a genuinely prehistoric, massive piece of sculpture. And then when you combine it with the star correlations, you get a second hit at that, which is also confirming the same very ancient date, and it begins to look like something extraordinary was going on there at the end of the last ice.
Why do you think the head on the Sphinx is so small compared to the body?
Again, John and Robert Schoch have gone into this in depth, and their view, which I totally endorse, is that the Sphinx was originally a lion-headed monument.
Right.
As well as a lion.
Totally a monument to Leo.
It was totally a monument to Leo, and in the time of the pharaohs, around 2500 BC, one of those pharaohs, perhaps Khafre, who is associated with the Sphinx in some way, perhaps what he did was he recarved the Sphinx and recarved its head into a human head, if not his likeness, the likeness of some other pharaoh.
Right.
And in doing that, they lost a lot of the mass of the head. And that's why the human head, is now out of proportion to the
right.
The
so if they wanted to have the headdress at the bottom be that wide, that width would have had to go all the way up originally. Yeah. So they had to get rid of a lot of stone.
They had to get rid of a lot of stone
Yeah.
In order to turn it into a human-headed monument, and that's what seems to have happened there. So the rather intriguing situation is that. The trench that surrounds the Sphinx, the core body of the Sphinx was created by hollowing out a huge trench in the bedrock around it.
Oh.
And the rock that was taken out of that trench, which was chopped up into massive blocks of stone, some of them weighing, 100 tons, was then moved forward and raised up into two gigantic temples.
The Osirion?
No, that's further south. But the Osirion, I do believe you're quite right. The Osirion belongs to the same period and the same style of architecture.
Okay.
But at Giza itself, you have what's called the mortuary temple and the Valley temple next door to the Sphinx. And these temples were built out of the bedrock that was removed to create the core body of the Sphinx. And
how big stones are we talking here?
We're talking 100-ton blocks, which is, well, let's say that's the weight of 50 large family cars in the case of each block. But the point is that if we are clear that the Sphinx is a prehistoric monument, that it dates perhaps to 12,000 years or more, then we're also saying that those temples with their 100-ton blocks date to the same period. And this then raises again the question of a lost technology, because the world 12,000 years ago was supposed to be inhabited only by relatively primitive hunter-gatherers. And for them to have created a temple on this scale with this massive blocks of stone is quite impossible according to conventional archaeological theory. So there's something very mysterious.
What about these little the diorite vases?
Again, this is all another element that leads us to wonder what was going on in Egypt. The hollowing out of very long-necked, slender-necked jars out of extremely hard kinds of stone, such as diorite. And in some cases, there's evidence that power tools have been used. This is particularly so with the what's called the sarcophagus. I don't believe it was ever used as a coffin, but the sarcophagus in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid.
Really? There's drill marks in there?
Yes, and drill cores have been found. It seems that they were using a tubular drill which drilled down into the stone, and from the drill cores it is possible to establish the speed at which the drill was moving, and it was moving at the speed of a modern power tool, not at the speed of a hand cranked drill.
Yeah, but that's granite.
I know, it's one of the hardest rocks known to man, and they were cutting down into granite, and they're only supposed to have had, even if they had a diamond head to the drill, which is not impossible, they're not supposed to have had any hard metal, so they only had copper in the Old Kingdom, and the pressure and the speed of rotation, even if you put diamond head on a copper tube, the copper is going to buckle and break. So it's just a huge range of mysteries.
This is Christopher Dunn that did a lot of this
absolutely.
work. Yeah.
This is Christopher Dunn, and I cite him at length in Fingerprints of the Gods.
Okay.
Christopher Dunn is himself a man who's worked with machine tools all his life. He absolutely knows what he's speaking of, and his book, The Giza Power Plant, gives all the detailed backup evidence on this on this drilling technology.
And some of these vases you can't even get your pinky through the mouth, right? And yet they're hollow inside.
Exactly. They've done mysterious things which we don't fully understand. And the conclusion I came to, looking at this issue, not only in Egypt but all around the world, again. For me, the best explanation for this is that we're dealing with a lost civilization. We're dealing with the remnants of a lost technology, some of which was preserved and passed down in certain ways and found its way into the beginnings of historic Egypt in the Old Kingdom. But that the origin was not there, that it's older.
Yeah, you said that Egyptian civilization looks as if it just appeared
out of nowhere,
from a legacy somewhere else.
Out of nowhere, just out of the blue. Suddenly, one minute they're making relatively humble, simple structures, and the next minute they're building something like the Great Pyramid.
Well, this gets into the fact that the capital city of Egypt, of course, is Cairo. And what does the word Cairo mean?
Well, that means Mars.
Right.
It means Mars.
So now, as we go into that, people who might have been with you up until this point, now we've gone even further into the fringe. But what is your feeling of connection between Mars and...
My work all the way along the line has been work of synthesis, bringing together the research of many people who work in this field. And I was absolutely intrigued by Richard Hoagland's work on Mars and on the monuments of Mars. And I felt that it was worth considering that seriously. And the book The Mars Mystery, which again Robert and I wrote together, does look at this. Now we are not necessarily advocating an extraterrestrial origin to ancient Egypt. We're saying that something interesting is going on, and let's look at all the evidence. My side of the Mars Mystery was to look primarily at the evidence for cataclysms in the solar system. It seems that the planet Mars, possibly quite recently, was hit by a devastating cataclysm. Something ripped off half of the crust of Mars and just lost it. I mean, something absolutely catastrophic happened there. It's quite possible that something equally catastrophic could happen to our planet when you look into the issue of near-Earth asteroids and long-period comets whizzing around the solar system at vast speeds.
And people may not understand that there are some undeniably strange, gigantic structures on the surface of Mars.
Yes.
There's what they call the D&M pyramid for Vincent de Pretro and Greg Molinar, and it's a 5-sided pyramid, very clear, unambiguous, absolutely a pyramidal shape in a pentagon kind of formation.
I was very impressed by the D&M pyramid, very impressed by the work that Richard Hoagland and others have done on that structure and on the whole Cydonia setup. Very impressed by the face on Mars. Now, we all know that NASA came out with photographs which made the face on Mars look like, what was it they said?
A cat box.
A cat box. But I have to say, I don't think I'm alone in this. I just don't totally trust everything that NASA say and do.
Well, there's lots of pictures where you see a really nice plateau and it's just shaped all the way around, and then the face is sitting on top of it and it's got 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. It's all symmetrical.
Exactly. I think we were the subject of a disinformation campaign at that point. For some reason, the powers that be seem to want us not to think that there may be artifacts, the work of intelligent beings.
Well, and Mars. It's a human face too.
And it's a human face. I know. It's extremely intriguing, extremely interesting, and very, very hard to explain. First of all, we have to fight our way through the vast mass of disinformation that has been generated on this subject, and maintain our curiosity at least for what on earth was going on Mars, and what the origin of those structures might be, and why they contain huge amounts of recognizable geometry, some of which is found in monuments on Earth as well. I don't claim to have an answer to this. The book's called The Mars Mystery because it is a mystery. But what Robert and I wanted to do in that book was to synthesize all the available data on the subject and present it to the public so they can make up their own mind. You
found some hard empirical connections between the geometry on the Giza Plateau and the geometry on the Cydonia Plateau on Mars.
I have to. This is not my work.
Right.
We are synthesizing the work of others in this respect. And again, I would refer you to the voluminous work of Richard Hoagland for the details on the geometry. I don't want to speak of what Richard Hoagland himself should be speaking of. But there's evidence for very, very curious similarities. And the whole, again, Richard Hoagland, the whole 19.5 degree thing when you come to Teotihuacan in Mexico, sitting at 19.5 degrees north of the equator, and the presence of pyramids on that site. My feeling is there just is something that hasn't been properly explained to us. I find it very frustrating. I find it very annoying. I still think that the face on Mars is a face. I am not at all convinced by the material that NASA put out there.
Sure.
And I think we are going to get to the truth on this sometime in the future. Now, are we dealing with an extraterrestrial civilization? Are we dealing with a human civilization that somehow got to Mars a very long time ago? Who knows? Who knows the answer to that question?
Right.
I don't have anything against extraterrestrials. I think the universe is full of life. I actually think that's what the universe is for. I think it's a home for life, a home for experience. But I haven't found it necessary in my work to go down the ancient astronaut route. Particularly, I've preferred to look at the mystery of a possible lost human civilization. But once we buy into that, once we accept that we may be a species with amnesia, that we may have forgotten glorious and dramatic aspects of our past, then we have to consider the possibility that there might even have been a spacefaring civilization on this planet. Did it come from this planet to this planet from elsewhere? Did it go from this planet to somewhere else? I don't know the answer. My job is to spell out the mystery and then let people work with
and you found submerged architecture all over the world.
Well, this is again a follow-on from as my work progressed. Really wanting to get to grips with the whole issue of a lost civilization. The thing that really struck me was at the end of the Ice Age, you have this dramatic rise in sea level. You have more than 400 feet sea level rise right the way around the world. It swallows
400 feet.
400 feet.
I didn't know that.
It's
That's
it's
a lot.
an absolutely gigantic sea level rise. You have to consider that the sea level everywhere in the world was 400 feet lower than it is today.
And that would have happened probably with a tsunami as well. So you're talking about...
It happened in a series of episodes, and when they happened incredibly fast. What happened was that the ice that had melted down for thousands of years on top of the ice caps into gigantic glacial lakes would suddenly burst its banks, and you would have just the size of an ocean spilling out into the ocean all at once and raising sea level very
Well, if you
fast.
have all that weight sitting on the crust, and when it pops off, the crust is going to bounce up, wouldn't it?
It's called isostasy. The weight of the ice caps on the land depress the crust. As the ice melts and comes off, the crust starts bouncing back again. All of this has to be taken into account in working out exactly what the world looked like during the last ice age. And I was very lucky in my book Underworld to be able to work with Dr. Glenn Milne from the University of Durham in the north of England. He and his team are the world's leading geologists on the science of sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age.
Okay.
And they have a fantastic computer program that will show you to an astonishing degree of accuracy what any coastline looked like at any time in the last 30,000 years. And working with that, first of all, I went back to the problem we were discussing earlier, the problem of the maps. And I found many more maps which accurately depict the world as it looked during the last Ice Age. And secondly, my wife, Santha, who's a photographer, and I learnt to scuba dive back in 1996 or 1997. And we then did 5 years of intensive diving all around the world. We lost count of the number of dives.
Wow.
In the mysterious underwater monuments of Japan, the area called Yonaguni alone, we know that we put in more than 200 dives on that site. and probably we're looking at 1,000+ dives all the way around the world.
Well, and I've seen some of the photographs of Yonaguni. I mean, it must be incredible to be down there, because those stones are definitely not
They're definitely
a natural
not
formation.
A natural formation. I have
very
no
well
doubt
sculpted,
about that.
right angles, sharp edges.
Exactly.
And isn't there like a tribal face carved into one of the stones?
There's a place called they call it the face, and they also call it the stone stage, because there's a flat stage-like area in front of it, and then a huge rock-hewn face above that, human face looking exactly due south. It's the combination of about 5 different major monuments within the space of approximately 500 yards off the south coast of Yonaguni that absolutely convinces me that we are dealing with man-made structures hewn out of solid rock.
Right, so these are massive stones.
They're massive stones. They're megalithic structures. And the problem is that many people who criticize them either can't dive very well themselves or have never dived there. You have to be a skilled, competent diver.
How far down is it?
You're looking at 110 feet at the bottom of the monument, so you're 110 feet below the surface of the sea.
So you're saying that couldn't have been above sea level anytime recently?
The last time that was above sea level was more than 12,000 years ago. And this, again, puts us back into a period when Orthodox history says there was no such thing as a civilization anywhere on Earth.
So is this what some people call Lemuria, you think? Or
well, I'm not a big fan of the concept of Lemuria or of Mu. Simply because Lemuria is a sort of relatively modern scientific idea that generated from the presence of lemurs on both sides of the Indian Ocean. But you read James Churchward and you saw he has all these symbols that show up all over the place. Yeah, he's talking about Mu.
Right.
But again, he bases himself on Le Plongeon, and Le Plongeon mistranslates a Mayan stela to find the name Mu. I'm not convinced at all. I'm not convinced that there ever was a civilization called Mu. I am convinced that there was a lost civilization in the Pacific.
Right.
As a matter of fact, the Pacific, and Churchward is absolutely right there. I think calling it Mu is a jump too far for me.
Okay.
But let's say a lost civilization by any other name. The Pacific was one of the areas that was most severely hit by the rise of sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. There's a whole area there which geologists call the Sunda Shelf. It's almost a continent-sized area off Southeast Asia and stretching out to the Philippines, which was all above sea level until about 13,000 years ago and went under in a gigantic cataclysm. And again, if you look around that whole area, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, you find incredible myths of a lost civilization, of a former golden age, and of course we've discussed this before, but not in this discussion, but at other times. For example, the flying machines that are mentioned in ancient Indian texts,
Vimana.
The Vimanas. It just my feeling is, of course, we have a mass of Orthodox history. We have serious and dedicated scholars who are telling us it's not like that. But my feeling is there's enough evidence now out there in the world, at least to raise our curiosity. We should not write off this question. It's very important to understanding who we are. If a great civilization was destroyed in antiquity by unknown earth changes, we have to consider the possibility that that could happen to us too. We shouldn't be so arrogant and imagine that we are the apex and the pinnacle of human achievement. We may just be another blip in a very long story. The whole story of human history may be cyclical, not linear.
So clearly these Hindu scriptures that we've looked at, they're describing these Vimana, but they are very strange descriptions. They're talking about things that can fly through mountains, things that have weaponry, that they make a humming noise as they go through the air.
There are even accounts of what look like nuclear weapons. That's the best way we can construe them from what is...
The elephants screaming and burning.
The Brahmastra weapon, the fire of the sun. I mean, really, they're extraordinary accounts.
Yeah.
And it's hard to believe that those writers of ancient scripture just made it all up. It's like they're reporting again a technological episode on the Earth in remote prehistory, and I think it's high time that we listened to that and paid more attention to it.
Well, no, I don't know. I've never asked you this, so this is a live question. But Ram C2. this legend in Hindu times of a land bridge that was built by the gods, of these stones that seem to have strange properties because they float in the water. Did you ever look into that one?
Well, if you're speaking of the land bridge between Sri Lanka
Sri Lanka.
And southern India, not only have I looked into that, but I've dived in that area.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And there are indeed massive structures underwater going down. We have again dived there to depths below 100 feet below sea level. And we found, for example, off Bumpahar, which is exactly in that area between India and Sri Lanka, a gigantic U-shaped structure, definitely man-made, and definitely been underwater for more than 12,000 years.
You think it was like to keep the sea out from something?
Well, the interesting thing is that the notion that is contained in the ancient texts of Sri Lanka being connected to mainland India is actually true. The geology makes it absolutely clear that Sri Lanka was connected to mainland India until the meltdown of the Ice Age and until sea levels rose. So again, the very fact that idea is spoken of in ancient scriptures means they are passing down to us a piece of knowledge that they absolutely should not have had if Orthodox history is correct. And again, that is very convincing. And there are intriguing remnants all over southern India and stretching down into the ocean beyond southern India. You know, in southern India they had a tradition called the Sangam tradition, where they speak of something that's almost exactly like Atlantis.
Really?
An advanced civilization with extraordinary building capabilities that existed in a place where the ocean now is, south of India, where they had great academies and universities and centers of learning, which was destroyed in cataclysmic floods. And the weird thing is, they put exactly the same date on it that Plato puts on Atlantis in his account, because Plato is the earliest surviving source for the story of Atlantis. And that date is, again, around 12,000 years ago.
Wow. All right, so why are we... I mean, people are just going to laugh at you and say, if there were submerged man-made structures around India, then why haven't I heard anything about it?
Well, he
can go dive down there and see whatever he wants.
It's a very odd thing because again, mainstream archaeology seems reluctant to get to grips with this whole issue, and I'm not quite sure why. There's been very little follow-up on the diving investigations that we did. As a matter of fact, in 2002, with a team that we brought out from India and that we brought out from England, but working also with Indian archaeologists in India, we went diving off the city that's called Mahabalipuram in South India. We went there because fishermen had told Santa and I that they were catching their nets on structures underwater.
Oh my gosh!
And that when they free dive, they don't have scuba equipment. When they dive down to free their nets, they found buildings down there. And we were the first people to follow that extraordinary story that the fishermen were telling.
Wow!
Took an expedition out there, went diving exactly where the fishermen told us, and lo and behold, found a gigantic built complex underwater, and starting quite close to shore and extending out as much as 5 kilometers from the shore and going down to depths again of more than 100 feet. Now, the strange thing was that after we'd made that discovery and after the initial press conference, which was jointly shared with the Indian archaeologists, Indian archaeology suddenly fell completely silent on the matter. And there was no further investigation of it until, tragically, the great Boxing Day tsunami, which emptied out the bay in front of Mahabalipuram for about half an hour. And then everybody saw that there were structures underwater.
Oh my gosh!
And
are there any pictures of this?
Yes, there are. And
really?
After that, because it had entered the public domain in a very, very visible way, most recently there has been some minimal underwater archaeology done on that site that we found several years earlier.
No kidding.
But again, mysteriously to me, the mainstream archaeologists so far are confining themselves to what's called the intertidal zone, down to depths of just about maximum of 10 feet. And where you hit the really interesting stuff is down to depths of 100 feet and several kilometers from the shore. So I don't know. I don't know why this should be, why it should be this way. I've come across this problem also in Egypt, where mainstream archaeology again doesn't seem to want to get to grips with very intriguing mysteries that need to be investigated. Is it simply a matter of archaeology's commitment to a paradigm of history being so strong that they just can't bear to separate from it? Is it that they really believe all this stuff is nonsense? Perhaps they do. Or is it something more sinister than that, designed to deny us the truth of our true history? I'm not sure. I've actually given up trying to figure it out. I've done my best to put out the knowledge that I have, to share what I've seen and what I've experienced and present it there. And I do think if major resources, Santha and I were just two individuals totally funding ourselves, if you had the funding of a major oceanographic institute to search the coastal shelves all around the world for underwater ruins, I think we would reveal the absolutely unmistakable traces of a lost civilization.
Did you ever visit Lebanon?
Never visited Lebanon. I've not been to Baalbek.
Okay.
I would love to go to Baalbek, and I will do so one day. 1,000-ton blocks of stone?
Yeah.
What on earth are they doing there?
1,000 tons. I mean, they're so huge that even the pyramid stones and all the other stuff we're talking about pale by comparison.
They pale by comparison. They're
I mean,
utterly astounding. And again, they're trying to tell us that these were put there by the Romans. I'm sorry.
That's
a Roman
the skeptic's
temple,
explanation?
Yeah, that's the skeptic explanation. A Roman temple was built on top of it. That's true. But the substructure is absolutely megalithic prehistoric architecture of the kind that you do find in Egypt, in the Valley Temple next door to the Sphinx, and indeed, as you mentioned earlier, in the Osirion in Abydos.
Right. I saw a scale picture of a man standing on it, and it's like the guy's like this tall, and the stone is.
Yeah.
I mean, they're absolutely enormous.
Yeah, they're enormous. So I think we have to say there are extraordinary mysteries in the past, and these mysteries are important because they have something to tell us about ourselves. I mean, a man or a woman with amnesia who've forgotten their own life story are gravely disadvantaged by that. What if that's the case for the whole human species? That we've forgotten our own life story, that we don't remember the truth about ourselves because there had been too much cataclysm, too many years have passed, it's all got mixed up and confused in myth and memory, so that we don't really have a clue. How can we proceed forward if we don't know where we came from?
It's almost like we have a genetic, like most people have a genetic trigger where if you start bringing out information that suggests that these cataclysms happen, they automatically attack you. There's like this. Yeah. There's like a genetic no. You can't. We're not supposed to know this. We can't know this.
It's an extraordinary thing, and it's actually why because I did become a little bit defensive in my work as my work moved on from the sort of grand explosion of Fingerprints of the Gods, when I just sort of threw it all out there,
right,
to later more considered books such as Underworld, where I had to consider, as I was writing the book, I had to consider that there was going to be an army of hostile archaeologists out there who would want to find any chink in the armor of my case to bring the whole case down. If I can just find one fault, then we can then this is classic disinformation technique. We find one little fault, then we can elaborate that out to suggest that the whole work is contaminated. And so I became very, very cautious about how I presented information. And whenever I made an extraordinary claim, I did try to back it up at great length with extraordinary information. And it's why in Underworld I do not actually investigate. I did in Fingerprints of the Gods, but in Underworld I don't really go into the question of what caused the cataclysm. I can confine myself purely to the facts, which nobody can dispute, that the end of the last ice age was a mysterious and cataclysmic episode, when extraordinary earth changes did take place, when sea level rose by 400 feet, when more than 10 million square miles of the best land on earth was flooded by those rising seas. That's roughly the equivalent of Europe and China added together in terms of size. That's what's missing from our story.
Right, and most people like to settle by the ocean so they can have a good view.
It was the best land on earth during the last ice age. Little example, the Persian Gulf. Persian Gulf was all dry land at the end of the last ice age. A huge river system ran through it, the combined streams of the Tigris and the Euphrates. There were gigantic fertile lakes in the bottom of that valley. It was a pleasant valley then, and it was flooded. by those rising sea levels and became the place we see it today. What a wonderful place to do underwater archaeology if anybody would actually put their minds to it in a serious way.
Now, have you heard about the western tip of Cuba?
Yes, I've heard of. I do report this in Underworld. There have been some developments since. This is the discovery of what look like man-made structures at a depth of more than 2,000 feet beneath the sea.
Yeah,
2,200 feet. Now, when you're talking about a site that is 2,200 feet beneath the sea, you are not only talking about rising sea levels at the end of Ice Age, you're talking about something even more dramatic than that.
Yeah.
Could it be some kind of landslip that carried this material down to a greater depth? Possibly. Who knows? Some people, but it may be disinformation, have suggested that what's been found there is a remnant of the Cuban Missile Crisis, stuff that was dumped off Russian ships.
No,
that's the kind of story you hear all the time. Nevertheless, it's been thrown out there. Again, it puzzles me that although the site has been identified, although video images have been captured on the site, up to this day, as far as I'm aware, the serious investigation of that site has never been pursued. And I don't know why that should be.
Yeah, you have Paul Weinsweig and Paulina Zalitsky with a company called ADC, or Advanced Digital Communications, who got a contract with the Cuban government to do side-scan sonar readings of the ocean seafloor around Cuba, looking for sunken Spanish galleons with lots of gold on them.
Yeah.
And they'd say, hey, Castro, we'll give you as much gold as you want. Just let us do this. If we find something, you're in on the deal, totally. So then what they find when they do these sonar readings is stuff that very much looks like buildings. Paulina Zalitsky was able to send submersibles down there. There is video of it. I've spoken to Linda Moulton Howe. She used to have it on her website. Then what do? They signed a contract with National Geographic, summer 2003. I'm sure you remember this.
Yes, I do.
It was supposed to be worldwide. It was supposed to be this big thing.
I was expecting to see the really good footage that would follow from National Geographic being involved. Instead, the whole thing has fallen mysteriously silent.
We've never
I
talked
don't know
about
why
this.
it's fallen silent.
We've never talked about this, but I was on the Art Bell Coast to Coast show talking about some of these things, and this female soldier who had worked at Guantanamo emailed me and said that back in the early 80s, she was stationed at Guantanamo, and one of the SEALs got drunk at a hot dog barbecue and says, we found Atlantis down there, and said that during the Cuban Missile Crisis that our American nuclear subs were going around Cuba trying to make sure nothing was going on, and they see pyramids, sphinxes, buildings, roads. Paulina has seen inscriptions down there that look similar to Greek and hieroglyphics and stuff.
Interesting.
This guy told her that there was a massive effort to remove any artifacts that could be reverse engineered into technology that the enemy could get their hands on.
Interesting.
And that they had working machines down there, including lights that just stayed on and never went off.
You see, once again, we're dealing with this strange thing that whenever we seem to be on the edge of really revealing the truth about our past, it's snatched away. And this leads us to an area of inquiry which becomes very murky and very dark, and you begin to wonder what manipulative forces are at work in human affairs. Who has an interest in keeping us in the dark about our past? Why can't we just have open and honest inquiry into these things? It's down there. We have the technology. It's whatever it is, the world has a right to know. And
if the media were to contact you about your undersea excavations and discoveries around India, are you willing to openly share everything that you know?
Absolutely. I already have openly shared it in Underworld.
They're just not paying attention to you.
They're just not paying attention, because this is automatically considered as lunatic fringe kind of stuff. Even though I personally have always tried to follow it in an extremely rigorous and even scholarly manner.
Right.
And to put my money where my mouth is, putting myself underwater on hundreds and hundreds of dives, both me and Santha, in risky, dangerous environments, sometimes with huge currents operating. We put our lives on the line for more than 5 years to pursue this investigation. Even though the investigation had that depth and seriousness, very little attention was paid to it in the mainstream. I'm not bitter about that. I regard it as absolutely the way the world works. I will continue to explore mysteries. I'll continue to tell my truth the way I see it.
Yeah.
In the passage of time, we'll find out who's right, who's wrong.
Now, you have another book called Heaven's Mirror, and what is Heaven's Mirror? And
Well,
how did you go from Underworld to that?
Heaven's Mirror is first of all, it's a photographic book, and actually it was done before Underworld.
Oh, okay.
And Santha is the photographer on that book. I wrote the text, and the purpose of that book was to show an extraordinary worldwide phenomenon, which is the mirroring on the ground of the patterns of the stars in monuments and structures.
Oh, really? So it's way more than just what Bouval discovered in Egypt?
It takes the investigation outside of Egypt. For example, a big focus of Heaven's Mirror is Angkor in Cambodia. Again, the details are in Heaven's Mirror, but we're looking at a representation of the constellation of Draco on the ground in Angkor, where again it is depicting that constellation in its positioning in around 12,500 years ago, not today. And then
same thing.
And again, I make the point in Heaven's Mirror, which I don't believe anybody had noticed before, which is that Angkor is precisely 72 degrees of longitude east of Giza, and that brings us back to
incredible.
Those precessional numbers, and it begins to look like a system that was imposed on the world, some kind of grid using precessional numbers and creating node points which later on became developed as sacred sites. So I'm suggesting that both Angkor and Giza have been sacred to some purpose for more than 12,000 years. And it doesn't matter if later civilizations came along and built their stuff there as well. There's no doubt that the temples as we see them today in Angkor date from around 1100, 1150, 1200 after Christ. But they sit on top of older and older structures, and I think if we go all the way down, we're going to find ourselves right back at the end of the Ice Age again. Okay. So it was an attempt to show that there's a worldwide system of as above, so below, of copying on the ground what is seen in the stars, either actually representing the patterns of stars on the ground, as at Angkor, as at Giza, or creating a union point between sky and ground, a monument that targets the spring equinox, that targets the rising sun on the summer solstice, for example. These are common. The extraordinary pyramid of Kukulkan in Chichen Itza, in the Yucatan in Mexico. Where the pyramid is so perfectly situated that again on that special day, the 21st of March, the spring equinox, for about 20 minutes, and Santha and I have been there and sat there and observed this amazing phenomenon.
The stairwell serpent thing?
The serpent. There's a serpent's head at the bottom of the northern staircase. And
a sculpted head?
A sculpted head. And there's no body to that serpent. But just for 20 minutes in the evening, around about 5:20 in the evening, it suddenly comes alive, and the shadow pattern of the whole body of the serpent is seen running up the stairway.
I didn't know that still works now.
It still works today, as it worked when it was first created, and it is meant, and that monument is speaking of sky and ground at exactly that moment in time, at exactly the equinox.
So why the serpent? What's the big deal with the serpent?
Well, the serpent is the image of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the civilizing deity who brings civilization to the ancient Americas, and who then vanishes, and who will return to usher in a golden age. This is what is indicated, and let us only hope that's what 2012 means. That a golden age is coming ahead of us, even though we may have to pass through difficult times to get there.
Couldn't some people ignorantly say that if they're sacrificing people on these pyramids, that the serpent is the devil, and that they're doing that for a satanic ritual or something?
Some people could ignorantly say that, and they do say that. And furthermore, and again, I go into this at length in Heaven's Mirror, particularly less so with the Maya, but the Maya also performed human sacrifice, more so with the Aztecs, who performed human sacrifice on an absolutely industrial scale.
Right.
You find this horror taking place associated with these amazing and wonderful monuments. Now, what's going on there? I think, I argue this case at length in Heaven's Mirror, that what is going on there is again a loss of memory, a degradation, that the fine principles for which these amazing structures were first established were forgotten by later cultures, who slipped gradually into a horrific kind of urbanized barbarism.
So they weren't sacrificing in the beginning. I
believe that this was a later collapse. You could almost call it a fall. This was a fall that we see evidence for there, and where really rather sophisticated ideas expressed symbolically about the need not to concentrate on the material body and on the material world, but to concentrate on the spiritual self, were interpreted literally by later cultures and were used as an excuse for this horrific, sadistic human sacrifice. But I think that we need to look beyond that to the ideas that are expressed in the structures themselves, and indeed the prophecies and the understanding of the universe that they convey.
But some people are still going to be really freaked out about why a serpent. So what do you feel like the symbolism of the serpent is? Why would somebody want to build a serpent on a pyramid?
Well, first of all, Quetzalcoatl is the feathered serpent. Okay. That's his position, and then it's very old in Central America. I've been to Villahermosa, where they have the objects from the Olmec objects from La Venta. Okay. And these date back. Of course, you can't accurately date stone. You can only say it's at least that old. And there's a stone structure there which is at least dates from 1,500 before Christ. In other words, it's already at least 3,500 years old.
Wow!
It's a lot older than the Maya or the Aztecs, who both venerated the feathered serpent. And there, on that ancient monument, we find the same figure of the feathered serpent.
Okay.
And what this means, does it suggest some sort of reptilian intelligence, some sort of alien connection with the Earth? Maybe. I don't know. Again, I don't go there in my work. Okay. I'd rather leave that to others to explore.
I know Maurice Cotterell went into it and talked about the Crotalus dorissus rattlesnake, yes. And the pattern on the snake is replicated in Mayan ruins and stuff.
Yeah. There clearly was veneration of serpents, and I suppose in a way that leads us on to the most recent of my non-fiction books, which is Supernatural, where I do look at the visionary experiences of shamans, and it is quite intriguing how shamans all over the world, in altered states of consciousness, have visions of serpent-like beings, and these serpent-like beings are intelligent and they are not evil, and they appear to want to teach wisdom to the world. And you find them. I was recently in Utah looking at petroglyphs and rock art in Utah, dating back in some cases 4,000 or 5,000 years. American Indian rock art. Very interesting serpent images there, where the serpent has the head of some other kind of animal. Exactly the same serpent imagery is found in South Africa, thousands of miles away, from a totally unconnected culture, where the common factor is shamanism and altered states of consciousness. And I think that's
pretty wild.
Yeah, I think that we don't have time to go into this in depth tonight, but I think that this question of accessing the realm of vision and of the work of shamans cannot be dismissed lightly. I think that it's also part of the ancient legacy that's come down to us.
So in your book Supernatural, you're starting to drill into, okay, is there a connection between these ancient monuments and something that has maybe not originated on this planet but has been coming here?
Yeah. I certainly am, and I had again, because my pattern of research is to immerse myself in the subject personally, rather than simply to sit in an armchair and work from books and references. I went down to the Amazon and I drank ayahuasca many times, which is this visionary brew, with Amazonian shamans.
That's the right way to do it.
It's the right way to do it, and so I have had a personal experience in the visionary state.
I mean, did you?
It's like entering a seamlessly convincing parallel universe, which is inhabited by intelligent beings that often take a part animal, part human form.
Interesting.
And again, critics could easily dismiss this as just, my brain on drugs. But you have to realize that precisely the same imagery is found in rock and cave art all over the world, going back to the very beginnings of the artistic endeavor in the human story, which is more than 35,000 years ago.
Okay.
And the suggestion that I come to, and I only make this as a suggestion, is that what's happening with these curious molecules that are found in visionary plants is that they alter the receiver wavelength of the brain. That normally, and I must cite here Rick Strassman's fantastic work with
spirit molecule,
DMT, the spirit molecule, at the University of New Mexico, where Rick was, after a very difficult endeavor, was given permission by the federal government to conduct research with human volunteers and dimethyltryptamine, DMT. DMT is the active molecule in the ayahuasca brew from South America. His volunteers all began to report back visits to what appeared to be the same parallel realms, and meeting these serpent beings, and being given love and teachings by these beings. Now I know that there are factions who would say, that's the devil at work, but anybody who has encountered the ayahuasca spirit, as the Amazonians have, and as I have in drinking ayahuasca, will tell you with absolute confidence that we're dealing with a being of pure love, whose business is the planet, and who finds time to work with individual human beings to help us to improve ourselves, improve our behavior, improve our relationships to others. Ayahuasca is a tough journey, which confronts you with the truth about yourself and gives you the opportunity to make changes.
Well, anybody who's into Zen Buddhism or Taoism or Asian culture, the dragon always symbolizes wisdom, and it's a flying dragon.
Exactly. And
so you're saying that's the same kind of thing happening?
I'm saying it's exactly the same kind of thing happening. And
so then who are these guys?
And there are definitely connections also with the whole issue of ET abductions, because we do, again, that Rick Strassman's work absolutely documents this, that many of his volunteers on a hospital bed in New Mexico, definitely not physically abducted. Their consciousness was being abducted, and they were being. Some of them were taken up onto what they saw as UFOs or spaceships.
Really?
And procedures were performed on them. Objects were inserted under their skin, crystals put into their brain. This was the experience they had, and that they reported. And that experience
were they terrified or?
Yes, sometimes terrified.
And
sometimes
these looked like your typical ETs and Greys?
Yeah, there were those appeared as well as the serpent beings, and
so somebody ought to think twice if they're going to drink ayahuasca.
Well, it raises the question of what phenomenon we're actually dealing with here,
right?
And it is a phenomenon undoubtedly that has physical aspects, but also psychic aspects, and I think that my own view. Is that we are dealing with some kind of interdimensional contact. The reason I brought up Rick Strassman's work is that the analogy he makes is that our brains are most of the time tuned into what he calls channel normal, everyday world. We're physical beings, whatever else we are, and we need to live on this planet. We don't want to walk under a bus or fall out of a window. We want to understand and deal with the laws of physics as they operate on this planet. And in order to do that, our attention is pretty finely tuned into the frequency of this planet, of physical life on this planet. However, what the visionary plants do, and what certain other altered states of consciousness that can be induced by rhythmic dancing, by certain kinds of music, even by meditation is allow us to retune the receiver wavelength of the brain, disconnect from this physical reality, and suddenly the much wider reality, which surrounds us all the time, but which is not normally accessible to our senses, is admitted in.
Right.
And therefore the suggestion is that these visions that shamans and modern volunteers in the University of New Mexico research share, they share the same imagery because they're literally going to the same place, and that we therefore may be dealing with parallel universes, with other dimensions.
So in Supernatural, you are providing hardcore proof that this is a real domain, that this is an actual location in some energetic sense.
Yes, that's absolutely
multiple people are going to in cultures all over the world, and they're painting the stuff on the...
When they return from
paintings.
the visionary journey and return to the normal state of consciousness, they recollect what they saw and they paint it and they draw it, and it's stunning. And I provide massive evidence for this, how you can take an image from the cave of Lascaux in France, dated at least 17,000 years old, and you can go into the Amazon jungle amongst the Tucano Indians and find that they have also created exactly the same image following an ayahuasca journey. And therefore the common factor has to be altered states of consciousness.
Wow.
And the suggestion that there may be, the subtitle of the book is Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind. And my suggestion is, through contact with parallel dimensions, parallel realms, humanity has been urged forwards on a number of occasions.
Has anybody wanted to make a TV documentary about this with you or anything yet?
No,
Really?
not so, because it brings up the subject of mind-altering drugs,
right.
And this is a subject that for most people is utterly taboo, and which they're just incapable of exploring without a huge knee-jerk reaction against it. But we have to remind ourselves that the cultures of South America, indeed all of the countries surrounding the Amazon basin, have a wise policy on this. They have, not only is it totally legal to drink ayahuasca in these countries, but the right of adult human beings to drink ayahuasca is protected under laws of religious freedom.
Wow.
And not regarded as some kind of freaky, aberrant behavior, but regarded as an essential part of our humanity.
No kidding.
That we need to have these experiences in order to fully realize who they are. So yes, well, I've documented all of this in Supernatural at great length. It has not been followed up anywhere. Again, I'm not surprised. But I hope in time that my attempt to tell my truth on this matter will come out and be shown to be right.
Terence McKenna obviously went through all these entheogens, as they're called, and felt that realm was giving him information about a big change coming to the world in 2012. Yeah. So have you explored the connection between this unseen realm that people are accessing via DMT and the idea that these energies or these intelligences are somehow directing us to the idea that there's going to be a golden age? I have, and I do that in Supernatural. Okay.
And to cut a long story very short there, I would just cite the words of shamans who I've discussed this matter with in the Amazon. And what they say is this: first of all, surveying the horrific destruction that is being inflicted on the Amazon by modern industrial society, and secondly, looking at the state of rampant chaos in the world at large. Those shamans feel that it is a matter of paramount importance that the visionary realm that ayahuasca opens up should be made available to Westerners, and there are huge efforts now to bring ayahuasca out of the Amazon and to bring it into the Western world. And interestingly, the United States is actually leading the way here, because the Supreme Court in the United States recently passed a ruling that members of the União de Vegetal, which is one of the Brazilian urban so-called churches, a syncretic group that use ayahuasca as their sacrament, that their members in the United States may drink ayahuasca legally, that the US government will not interfere with this. And it looks like that right is going to be continuously extended. What the shamans say is that the whole crisis of the world today comes about because Western technological civilization has severed its connection to spirit.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
And that unless we reconnect to spirit, we are going to pass through a very difficult and catastrophic time. But if we can reconnect to spirit, then the possibility remains that we can pass through this difficult time into a golden age, into a rebirth of humanity, with all our potentials returned to us. Not the poor, fragmented creature we are today, told by the powerful corporations and by our governments that all that matters is the material world, brainwashed with hours of reality TV and advertisements telling us to go and buy this or that material good. Told that the only appropriate leisure activity is to go out and get absolutely drunk on alcohol, so that becomes a kind of relief from the horror of everyday life in industrial society. Right. That somehow we can reunite the fragmented parts of our human nature, bring back in our connection to spirit, to other realms, to other dimensions, and move forward again in a positive direction.
And you're saying that some of these new abilities have manifested in you with a new path of fictional writing as a result of
Yes, this was the great gift that ayahuasca gave me, as well. I'd always been open to the existence of parallel realms, but ayahuasca showed me these realms. But she, and I will speak of her as she, the great spirit that lies behind the ayahuasca brew.
Okay.
She also gave me a novel. She boosted my creativity in a way that it had never gone before. It was like I downloaded the whole story, and that's my latest book, which is called Entangled. It's going to be published in 2010.
Wow.
It's a fantasy adventure, a battle of good against evil, and the whole story, time travel, a character in the Stone Age, a character today, a time slip novel. They're interconnected. They're fighting a demonic force, and the whole story came to me in an ayahuasca vision, and many others have also been creatively influenced by ayahuasca. So I have no doubt that we're dealing with something positive and worthwhile here, which deserves to be explored further.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing with us your amazing testimony on so many levels. It's a fascinating documentation of the potential of the human spirit and of how much more there is in the past and in the future than what we've normally taken for granted.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you, Graham. It's a real pleasure to interview you today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your work, which is hugely important and making a difference in the world. And
I appreciate that.
I'm really pleased to see you doing it.
Great, and thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.